Meu nome é Otávio Dias, eu sou editor de conteúdo da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Estou aqui hoje substituindo o Sérgio Fausto, que é o diretor da Fundação, que todos vocês conhecem, que por questões ali pessoais, infelizmente não pôde estar presente hoje. Então, eu estou aqui substituindo e vou falar brevemente em português, depois vou passar a falar em inglês, né? Bom, nós temos hoje aqui o grande prazer de receber a professora Shoshana Zuboff, que vai nos brindar aí com 35 minutos, falando sobre o tema do seu mais recente livro. E depois nós vamos ter o Pedro Doria, nosso colega, que vai aqui nos ajudar fazendo perguntas à professora Shoshana. As perguntas do público são muito bem-vindas. Quem quiser fazê-las pode utilizar aqui o chat e também pode ser feita pelo Facebook. Quem estiver assistindo pelo Zoom tem a possibilidade de ouvir a nossa tradução simultânea, clicando aqui no botãozinho de interpretation, ou no Facebook não tem tradução simultânea, né? Nós vamos falar em inglês o tempo inteiro. Bom, então agora eu vou... aliás, eu gostaria de pedir licença para a gente mostrar aqui a nossa lista de patrocinadores, tá? Nosso grupo de empresas que patrocinam a agenda anual de seminários da Fundação Fernando Henrique. Agradecemos a todas as empresas, sem as quais a gente não teria condições de fazer esse trabalho aí, que é um trabalho bastante intenso da Fundação Fernando Henrique. E também nós gostaríamos os nossos co-realizadores hoje são a Aberge, tá? que está nos ajudando aí a organizar esse evento, junto com a Editora Intrínseca, que lançou o último livro da professora Shoshana, A Era do Capitalismo de Vigilância, a Luta por um Futuro Humano na Nova Fronteira do Poder. O livro está já nas livrarias e a Editora Intrínseca é a nossa parceira aqui. Inclusive, nós gostaríamos de mostrar uma imagem aqui do livro. Tá aqui já para todo mundo ver. Well, scholar, writer and activist, Shoshana Zuboff is the author of 3 major books, each of which signaled the start of a new epoch in the technology society. Her recent masterwork, The Age of Surveillance in Capitalism, already translated into 25 languages, has been hailed as the tech industry's silent spring and the dust capital of the 21st century. Professor Zuboff is the Charles Edward Ilson Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School and a faculty associate at the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights. Para entrevistá-la, to interview her, we have here Pedro Doria. Pedro Doria is an old friend, journalist as myself. He is one of the best journalists in technology, but also in politics. And he has a long experience in covering all this crazy technological era we are living on. And he also is the founder of a startup called Canal Meio, which every morning makes like a summary of the main news around the world and delivers it to the people who signs this newsletter very early in the morning. He is a columnist for the newspapers O Globo and Estado de São Paulo, and also for CBN Radio. And he is also a writer, and he has some very interesting books about Brazilian history. So he is thinking about the future, but also about the past and the present. So we think he's the best person to talk to Professor Shoshana. So now we are going to start. Professor Shoshana will have about 35 minutes to talk, and then we go on. Please, questions in the chat are very welcome. So, Professor Shoshana.
Thank you so much, Otávio. I have a few people and institutions that I want to thank as we get started. Obviously, the Fundação, I'm so grateful for your interest in this work, for your collaboration with my dear Brazilian publisher, Editora Intrínseca, and of course at my publisher, Gustavo Otran, who's had such an important role in publishing this book in Brazil. Also, thanks to Abeja for their collaboration in this event. And a special thanks to you, Otávio, and to Pedro. Pedro, your work is well known to me. I'm really grateful and honored that you participate in this event with me, and I look forward to our dialogue. And I want to give a special thanks also to Benedito Seberi and Giovanna Tieghi, because I know that they worked so hard with my team organizing this and making sure that we could bring you this event today. And finally, the most important thanks of all, thanks to all of you who have tuned in to join us today. Please ask your questions. And if your question somehow, isn't directly addressed in this conversation, the important thing is that you thought of a question. And that means that you're engaged and you're thinking about the deepest questions of power in our time. And I'm very grateful for your participation. So, as a way of saying thanks to everybody, I am going to start with a story, because nothing gets across the concepts that we want to understand today better than a story. And this story has the additional value of being true. So this is a story that was broke actually by really wonderful journalistic team at Channel 4 News in London. They broke this story in, I'm going to say, September of 2020. This was also an investigative team that had been part of the Cambridge Analytica story some years before. But in 2020, they broke a story about the Trump 2016 campaign's effort to deter Black citizens from voting on Election Day. The investigative team examined more than 5,000 leaked data files with details on 200 million individual American voters, along with the analyses and models used to profile things like, hear me out, personality traits, political attitudes, behavioral dispositions, interests, concerns, vulnerabilities, and more. All of this in order to target and manipulate voter behavior, especially in the key swing states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. The campaign's digital director, maybe you've heard of him, a gentleman named Brad Parscale, used Facebook's suite of, quote, ad tools to identify citizens least likely to support Trump in order to target them for deterrence. This included prominently 3.5 million Black voters. These Black citizens were bombarded with corrupt content designed to persuade them not to vote. Deterrence. This was conveyed by the standard range of algorithmic targeting mechanisms used in Facebook's advertising every single day. Subliminal cues, engineered social comparisons, psychological microtargeting, recommendation tools, real-time rewards and punishments, gamification, and more. These performed precisely as they are designed to do. They produce massive scale behavioral change. Black voter turnout declined by 7 percentage points, the largest decline on record for Black Americans, and 1 point more in those swing states I mentioned to you, where these manipulative efforts were concentrated. So, some years later, in 2020, Facebook executive Andrew Bosworth asked and answered the following question, quote, "So, was Facebook responsible for Donald Trump getting elected? I think the answer is yes," he said, "but not for the reasons that anyone believes." Mr. Bosworth laid Trump's success at the feet of Facebook's titanic machine operations known to the world as online targeted advertising. Mr. Trump was elected, Bosworth said, quote, because he ran the single best digital ad campaign I've ever seen from any advertiser, period. They just used the tools we had to show the right creative to each person. Pascal confirmed this conclusion in his inimitable style, quote, I always wonder why people in politics act like this stuff is so mystical. It's the same shit we use in commercial. It just has fancier names. All right, friends, what happened here? Citizens of the world's longest lived democracy relinquished their most solemn democratic right, the right to vote. They did this without anyone ever holding a gun to their heads. No one showed up in the dead of night to threaten them with the gulag or the camp. Instead, these citizens ceded the right to self-govern in response to nothing more than engineered digital communications, freighted with inflammatory messages and disinformation tailored to their individual psychological and political profiles until enough people chose to stay home on election day. This is not the totalitarian nightmare of Big Brother, who breaks bodies in order to bend souls to his single truth. This work here is accomplished by what I have called instrumentarian power, secretly wrung from data and able to work its will entirely through the medium of digital instrumentation. There's no blood here, no bodies. There's not even a single fingerprint, no enemy, no combat. Instead, this power comes on slippered feet, offering a cappuccino, seamless. So sometimes power arrives careening down the slopes that ring the valley, riding at a gallop to crush us at the gates. But in these days, our time of abstraction and mediation, this new power moves lightly, unannounced, an odorless, invisible poison whose signature is this: the very moment that we become aware of its peril is the moment that is too late. This new force draws its strength from a 21st century rendition of the alchemist dream, the transformation of knowledge into power. The economic institution that creates this transformational capability is what I have called surveillance capitalism. This 2016 story of the Trump campaign shows surveillance capitalism's bread and butter economic operations of data extraction, computation, algorithmic targeting, and behavior modification at work, but in this case, simply pivoted a few degrees to political rather than commercial outcomes. We see clearly that targeting is only personalization in the sense that individual users are made personally visible through an infinitely long rifle scope, able to discern not only each human bullseye, but their detailed reactions to the moment of impact. So what is surveillance capitalism? I have called the economics that shape these mechanisms surveillance capitalism because they maintain core elements of traditional capitalism, private property, market exchange, growth and profit, but these cannot be realized without the technologies and social relations of surveillance. Hidden methods of observation secretly consume human experience once considered private and translate that experience into behavioral data. They operate outside of human awareness, robbing actors of the right to know and with it the right to combat. And in an extraordinary development, these ill-gotten human data are then immediately claimed as private property, corporate assets available for manufacture and sales. Google founder Larry Page laid out the new vision in 2001, shortly after the breakthroughs that would change everything, as Page and his team declared their rights to our lives. Now, I'm quoting from Larry Page back then in 2001. If we had a category, Page ruminated, it would be personal information, the places you've seen, communications. Sensors are really cheap. Storage is cheap. Cameras are cheap. People will generate enormous amounts of data. Everything you've ever heard or seen or experienced will become searchable. Your whole life will be searchable. Google had been a technology company. Its business plan had called for selling search licenses to large internet companies and other corporate clients. All of that was abandoned. Instead of selling search, Google would achieve revenue growth by selling what it could learn about its users as Google searched people. Escape from financial ruin during the dot-com bust depended upon this turning, this flip, this transformation that made Google's search engine a sophisticated surveillance medium for the clandestine seizure of human data. The theory of surveillance capitalism challenges the property claim at the heart of this economic logic and redefines it as theft. In today's surveillance economy, personal information is the stolen treasure, and surveillance is the getaway car. The entire economic edifice is built on this illegitimate bed of sand. These data join complex supply chains. They travel to computational factories. They're computed into behavioral predictions. And then targeting algorithms are created, engineered, and finally sold to business customers in a new kind of market that trades in predictive knowledge of human behavior. These are commodity markets in human futures, akin to other commodity markets in things like pork belly futures or wheat futures or oil futures. Surveillance capitalists sell the promise of certainty, and it's a promise which requires data extraction and computation at an unprecedented and therefore unimaginable scale. The economic logic was discovered, invented, and honed, as I suggested, as a way out of financial emergency, producing the first globally successful human futures markets back in 2001, known to us as online targeted advertising. And between that year, 2001, when the methods were first applied, and 2004, when the company first went public, its revenue line increased by 3,590%. That is what I call the surveillance dividend, and it reset the bar for investors and companies alike. Targeted advertising, of course, was the beginning, but not the end. Surveillance economics were born at Google, migrated to Facebook, became the default model for the tech sector, but since then have migrated across what we think of as the normal economy. including the traditionally information-intensive sectors such as insurance and finance, but also retail, healthcare, education, real estate, agriculture, all kinds of production, and more. Today, literally every, quote, smart product, every, quote, personalized service, and every app has become a loss leader for behavioral data extraction, and thus the surveillance dividend. 2 decades later, the world's democracies confront a tragedy of the uncommons. The internet, our information and communication spaces as a market project, is a failed social experiment. And this failure has left a trail of social wreckage in its wake. Among this wreckage, we see the wholesale destruction of privacy, the nullification of fundamental rights, the intensification of social inequality, the poisoning of social discourse, divided societies, demolished social norms, and weakened democratic institutions. The US and other democratic governments chose to look the other way, in part because of their own interests in human-generated data, a tragic response to the attacks of 9/11. The result was a political economic void filled by the antisocial and anti-democratic economic institution of surveillance capitalism. The corporations learned how to own, operate, and intermediate the vast information spaces of global information flows and social communications. This institutionalization was almost entirely unconstrained by public law, despite the fact that these systems and infrastructures are mission critical to every democracy. I have spent the last 43 years studying the rise of the digital as a political economic force, propelling our transformation into an information civilization. Over these last 2 decades, I've observed the once young internet companies morph into surveillance empires powered by global architectures of surveillance economics, engineered for the domination of knowledge about people and society, and the power that accrues to such knowledge. A century ago, the corporate concentration of power was understood as economic power, and owners had all the authority on the strength of their property rights. The harms of concentration fell on people in their economic roles as workers, consumers, where they were vulnerable, unprotected. Decades of contest and collective action across our societies eventually produced laws, antitrust laws, for example, but also new charters of rights for workers and consumers, the purpose-built laws to protect those rights, and the institutions charged with their enforcement and governance. As important as those creations remain today, rights, laws, and institutions that were largely created in the early 20th century, and in some of our countries going back into the late 19th century. As important as those remain for us today, they simply do not protect us from the new harms, the social harms. In the age of surveillance capitalism, corporate power is not primarily economic, but it's social. And these social harms are not confined to individuals in their economic roles as workers and consumers. They fall upon users, a new category of humanity that means all of us, all the time, everywhere. Ours is a young information civilization that has not yet found its footing in democracy because the social harms we face simply cannot be shoehorned into Cinderella's 20th century legal slipper. So now it is we who march naked, we who are vulnerable and unprotected, without the rights, the laws, and the institutions purpose-built to govern our digital century in the name of democracy. In an information civilization, principles of social order derive from the essential questions of knowledge and authority over knowledge and the power that backs that authority. I summarize this in 3 questions. And if you remember nothing else from my remarks today, you can remember these 3 questions. Who knows? That's a question about the distribution of knowledge. Who decides who knows? That's a question about authority over that distribution. Who decides who knows? That's a question about power. Surveillance capitalist firms, beginning with the giants, now hold the answers to each question, though we never elected them to govern. On the strength of their property claims, the private surveillance empires have mounted a fundamentally anti-democratic epistemic coup. That means a revolutionary takeover of knowledge and knowing. They decide what is known, who can know it, and to what purpose. And the social harms that follow from this revolution leave lawmakers and the public continually whipsawed by each day's headlines, bleating the latest atrocity. Our comprehension has been thwarted by category errors. Social harms such as the wholesale destruction of privacy or information flows corrupted by defactualization or massive scale behavior modification and the rise of unaccountable power. These have been siloed. They're treated as distinct, disparate phenomena, leaving us in a tangle of disorientation, fragmentation, and confusion. As long as we view these harms as unrelated crises, they remain impossible to solve. The perspective of surveillance capitalism as an anti-democratic institution offers a way out of this frenzy. This institutional order reaches across the boundaries of individuals, organizations, sectors, communities, societies, and nations, intermediating virtually all human engagement now with digital architectures, devices, products, services, and information flows. Surveillance capitalism, like all institutions, is self-reproducing. So no matter how much we plead with individual leaders, please, Mr. Zuckerberg, please be nice to us, it can only do what it is engineered to do: reproduction and extension of its deepest logic and operations. Right now, as a result, all roads to economic and social participation lead through the institutional terrain of surveillance economics, a fact that has only grown with ferocity during these years of global plague. The economic institution of surveillance capitalism is the unified field in which the social harms we face are revealed as linked effects of a single cause, a unitary process of epistemic revolution that has unfolded in 4 stages, each of which is a demonstration of economic cause and social harm effect. Each develops the conditions and builds the scaffolding for what will follow. Each later harm derives from and builds on what went before, a unified field of a unitary process. I'm going to describe these stages very, very briefly. Perhaps during our discussion, we'll go into them in more depth. Stage one. This is what introduces the economic logic of surveillance capitalism, founded on the secret, massive scale extraction of human data. This economic cause produces a social harm effect. The wholesale destruction of privacy is actually a non-negotiable consequence of its operations. The rights to know our own experience and decide what remains private, these rights that I call epistemic rights, such rights are annulled and appropriated by the corporations. And though we continue to discuss privacy law and rights, data protection and so forth, the harsh truth that no one wants to hear is that privacy as we knew it, even as recently as the year 2000, that kind of privacy has been extinguished. Thanks to surveillance capitalism's years of spectacular growth, that privacy no longer exists. Now, with privacy out of the way, the path is cleared for stage two. Ill-gotten human data are now concentrated within private corporations where they're claimed as private property. The social harm effect of this economic cause is a new form of social inequality, epistemic inequality, defined as the growing gap between what I can know and what can be known about me. And if you have any doubt about this, I'm going to reference a leaked 2018 Facebook document, which illustrates this gap. It describes the company's AI backbone, which is described as a prediction engine. And it's described as, quote, ingesting trillions of behavioral data points every day. And with those data points, its prediction service is able to churn out, quote, more than 6 million behavioral predictions every second. This is the scale that we're talking about when we talk about epistemic inequality. In stage three, this is when knowledge becomes power. Human data are weaponized now as targeting algorithms and aimed back at their human sources, exactly as we saw in our story of 2016. But now, because we know that it is the most corrupt and inflammatory information that is most reliably able to increase engagement, this economic cause produces social harm effects in the form of epistemic chaos, expressed in degraded, corrupt, defactualized information. It is no coincidence that the 2 decades of surveillance capitalism's growth have also witnessed a sharp rise in autocracy around the world, as its surveillance capitalism's engineered indifference to corrupt information is exploited by political disinformation campaigns that aim to polarize society with hate and extremism and corrupt information, accelerating democratic decline. The targeting mechanisms that we saw in our story of the Trump 2016 campaign, these now shape the behavior of information producers and information users, aligning that behavior with the corporation's commercial and political advantage. Behavior is manipulated secretly from above in what amounts to a direct assault on individual autonomy at the grassroots, but also on the integrity of collective behavior. So far, as I read Facebook files and the documents supplied by whistleblower Frances Hogan this fall, the most chilling thing to me has been their concrete depiction of the realities behind these words, the assault on the integrity of collective and individual behavior. And of course, the clear economic intentionality that drives this assault. So in the Facebook files, we see Mr. Zuckerberg at Facebook wantonly playing his own personal celestial keyboard of humanity's collective behavior, reinforcing or extinguishing the actions of billions of people at will, as ordained by the economic imperatives to which he has pledged himself and his company. He pounds this key or that, and qualities of human experience and expression rise or fall. Content becomes more positive or negative. Anger is rewarded or ignored. News stories are more trustworthy or unhinged. Corrupt information is showcased or suppressed. Publishers prosper or wither. Political discourse turns uglier or more moderate. A young person is more or less depressed. People become healthy or sick. People live or die. Key to this shocking picture is that Mr. Zuckerberg and his company are not alone. These secretive capabilities to tune, herd, and modify collective behavior are essential to surveillance capitalism's most routine institutional operations. The compounded interest from harms begetting new harms is measured in the sharp escalation of corrupt information, fractured societies, and weakened democratic institutions the center does not hold. But not because we, the people, are no longer capable of holding it. Rather, both the center and the people have been overwhelmed by an unrestrained economic power. Neither Google nor Facebook nor any corporate actor in this new economic order set out to destroy society or democracy any more than the fossil fuel industry set out to destroy the earth. But like global warming, the tech giants and their fellow travelers have been willing to treat their destructive effects on people and society as collateral damage, the unfortunate but unavoidable byproduct of perfectly legal economic operations that have produced some of the wealthiest and most powerful corporations in the history of capitalism. Occasionally, the fog clears to reveal a fourth stage, epistemic dominance. Here is where we find the growing power of our tech giants, eager to compete with democracy for the governance of what passes for society when their revolution is complete. This is where the corporate surveillance empires vie with democracy over the fundamental rights and legal principles that will guide us by leveraging their absolute control and unaccountable power over critical information systems and infrastructures. The aim, ultimately, is to substitute their information systems for society and their computational governance for democracy. They will be the lawmakers. We can't fix all of our problems at once in our democracies today, but we won't fix any of them ever unless we reclaim the sanctity of information integrity and trustworthy communications as a necessary precondition to the resolution of all of our emergencies, from the breakdown of social solidarity to the fate of the earth and the survival of democracy itself. The abdication of our information and communication spaces to surveillance capitalism has thus become the meta-crisis of every republic because it obstructs solutions to all other crises. The surveillance empires want us to believe that their social harms are inevitable consequences of digital technologies, when in fact they are produced by novel economic imperatives, wholly contingent upon unique historical circumstances and dependent upon the absence of law. The third decade, our decade, this is now our opportunity to reverse these conditions. The longer we delay, the more difficult and fraught with violence this work will be. We stumbled into a future that we did not and would not choose. And the sober truth is that our democratic societies face a reckoning with the most basic questions. How should we structure, organize, and govern the global information and communication infrastructures of our digital century in ways that sustain and advance democratic values, principles, and aspirations? What are the purpose-built new charters of rights, legislative frameworks, and institutions required to ensure that data collection and use will serve the genuine needs of individuals in society? What measures will protect citizens from unaccountable power over information, whether it is wielded by private companies or governments? Make no mistake, this is the fight for the soul of our information civilization. We don't have these answers for many reasons, beginning with the fact that we've only just begun to ask the questions. And we've also been confounded by unprecedented conditions that mark a new phase in the technological development of civilization. The answers we seek cannot be found in the back of the book, and the book itself is not yet written. Finally, surveillance capitalism rooted and flourished under the tent of the market privileging ideology that reigned for most of the last 5 decades, especially in the US and the UK. Most people, including lawmakers, just assumed that the market would provide the answers and the rules of the game to govern those answers. But now we know better. So where does this leave us? Democracy is the only countervailing institutional order with the legitimate authority and power to change our course. If the ideal of human self-governance is to survive the digital century, then all solutions point to one solution: a democratic counter-revolution. For this to succeed, 3 conditions must be met: a public awakening and mobilization, a step change in lawmakers' comprehension and determination to act, and third, a transnational dialogue and collaboration. The counter-revolution is signaled by a new quality of conversation in which economic operations assumed to be settled, uncontestable, and undiscussable are revealed as the self-serving inventions of ruthless and wily monopolists whose trillion-dollar companies are built on a social harm machine that is now on course to unravel the psychological, sociological, and institutional bedrock upon which the very premise of democracy rests. There are already indications that these conditions may be emerging more quickly than anyone had predicted. Most compelling now is the accelerated pace at which the undiscussable is becoming discussable. We're seeing new developments, and certainly these developments are visible in the US, in the EU, and in the UK, and they suggest that we may be approaching a tipping point at which surveillance capitalism's social harm effects will no longer be tolerated by a growing majority. In closing, I'll finally just stress the fact that we can be a surveillance society, or we can be a democracy, but we cannot be both. This is not a story about technology, friends. It is a story about power, a story about politics. And in making this choice, we face the realization that democracy is not, never was, an implacable mountain, eternally presiding over birth and death. It is a fragile political condition dedicated to the prospect of self-governance, the greatest idea ever to emerge in the long story of humanity. This idea of self-governance has been sheltered by principles of justice, liberty, equality, and maintained by collective effort. Each generation is called to run alongside, as in the ancient game of hoop rolling. The mission is always the same: protect democracy from wobbling, protect it from falling over, keep it moving forward against the anti-democratic powers in a relay race that spans the centuries. Some say it is too late for a democratic digital future. It's not too late. It's exactly the right time to engage this fight, because now we know the questions, but there is not a moment to lose.
Now I would suggest that we have about 40 minutes for questions and answers. So I suggest that Pedro makes the first one, and then I will bring another one from the public, and then we are going to do this kind of division here.
I've been a journalist for enough time that I have written professionally stories on what email was, what the @ was, and that sort of stuff. And in those days, in the mid to late 90s, I was an avid reader of Wired magazine. And this magazine, it was the first magazine that was treating digital as a cultural and political story, and not only a tech story. And some writers like Stuart Brand, like John Perry Barlow, they wrote a lot in those years, in the late 90s, about how the internet was bringing democracy to the world, how open and how fantastic, and the amount of freedom we would have in this digital land. Well, were we naive? Was it inevitable that we would end how we ended? When did we go wrong?
Well, that's such a good perspective to bring to this discussion. You know, I was trained many years ago in social psychology. And in social psychology, there's a saying that goes, believing is seeing. Yeah. So our ideologies, our belief systems often blind us to, you know, what Orwell described as, you know, what's right in front of our nose, you know, the truth that's right in front of our nose. And I think there were actually, Pedro, I think there were legitimate reasons for people to feel very hopeful about the digital century, very hopeful about this idea of the democratization of knowledge. And there was a window, and I had concentrated a lot of my research at one point on this window, just what you're describing, the late 90s, right up until that point around 2004, when the mechanics of surveillance capitalism became public and people began to understand what it was. Investors began to understand it. That's, what they were then, everyone wanted to invest in companies that were able to supply the surveillance dividend. And then that changed the practices and the self-understanding of the startups. So, but there was a window before surveillance capitalism became known to us, where, when people talked about a smart home, or when they talked about, the opportunities for telehealth, things like that, the assumptions in the research and the applications that came out in the late 90s and the early 2000s, the assumptions were deeply privacy preserving. I write about the technical specs for a smart home. Spec is a closed loop. So there's data being generated by, within the home by devices and in the walls and sensors and so forth. But all the data only goes to the person or people who live in the home. It's a closed loop. And the engineers take special pains in their specifications to note, of course, this is very intimate information, and so it's going to have to be very private. So there was a window when the idea of, releasing knowledge that's been pent up in professional silos and institutions, and releasing it to the public, and this ideal of democratization, it made sense. It had a reality to it. But as soon as surveillance capitalism hit, and that surveillance dividend reset the bar, then all bets were off. This economic logic took hold so quickly. That's what's astonishing. These companies have gone from baby startups to trillion-dollar empires of immense power. In Facebook, it's 10 years. Google, 15 years. It's extraordinary. So coming back to believing is seeing, and why I think this is such an important issue. We believed for so long in that ideology that the digital was a democratizing force, that it prevented us, it blinded us from seeing what was right in front of our noses. The invasion of private experience, the commodification of our personal experience translated into behavioral data, and so this will be my final thought on this, and then I'll leave it for your next question. But because we believed and we didn't see, because we were blinded, we failed to come to grips with three extraordinary features of this new economic institution. We failed to understand what it means when human-generated data, personal data that we've always had assumed to be private, when that becomes the raw material commodity for commercial operations. That fact in itself is mind-boggling. Okay, number two, we failed to grasp the inevitable social harms that would follow from an economic logic in which revenues depend upon making all human behavior more predictable across every domain of everyday life. predictability, certainty. And finally, the third factor that we neglected to reckon with, and that is the fact that in this new economics, information integrity is inversely correlated with revenues. That fact alone is killing us. And the three together are what make, I heard Octavio said it's scary, but those three factors together are what make it scary. But I'm not scared, because I do believe that our democratic societies, that ultimately we have the capability to respond and turn the tide on this thing. Over to you, Pablo.
Good. At least you are not scared.
Otávio, I know you bring a question from the public, but
yes?
if Professor Shoshana just allows me a comment.
Oh, please, please.
Sure, sure.
Professor, you're not scared because you don't have a neo-fascist as a president.
Came close.
We do.
Came very close.
Yes.
Well, maybe you had. Okay.
And we're not out of the woods yet, as you well know, as everybody
Yes,
understands.
that's true. Yeah.
But
okay.
look, I'm not scared only because I'm, I take a longer view. And I in the past 3 years, I've talked to thousands and thousands and thousands of people around the world. And I do believe that there is the anger, the indignation, the beginnings of a mobilization, and that these conditions that I talked about are starting to constellate, and that there is every reason for us to put shoulder to the wheel to make these things happen. We won't be safe without all hands on deck, that's for sure. It's not a simple thing. It's not a Pollyanna vision. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I have lots of questions bubbling here, but I will behave and bring questions from the public, okay? So first, I have a question from Aberge, who is one of our
yes.
today. So Brazil is one of the countries that created specific legislation on data, the General Data Protection Law. And with that, companies operating in the country showed concern to the new LGPD. How can companies, especially the communication areas of these organizations, contribute to going beyond simple compliance with the standard, fostering a real culture of data protection?
Well, I think that there are many companies, existing companies, and many people who want to create new companies who want to do this without surveillance capitalism. But I believe that their opportunity to do this is going to be greatly enhanced by public law. When we talk about GDPR or the data protection laws in Brazil and in other countries, even outside of the EU, think about what we're talking about. We're talking about the protection of flows of data and concentrations of data, when many of those data should not exist in the first place, because they were illegitimately stolen from our lives. Facial recognition is a perfect example. They take my face, but they're not taking my face just to ID me. Oh, that's Shoshana Zuboff. They're taking my face to read the micro expressions in my face produced by hundreds of little muscles in my face. Those micro expressions have been correlated with emotions, very specific, nuanced emotions. And that's really important data for surveillance capitalism, because emotions are the best predictors of future behavior. And we're into predicting behavior. That's what it's all about. So here they've they've taken these things from me. You read an ad, Amazon's a couple of months ago, a press release touting that its facial recognition service can now read fear and can add fear to the 8 other emotions that was already able to read. Well, I don't give them the right to my fear. And yet, if we're talking about GDPR or similar bodies of legislation and regulation, we're talking about my fear and many other forms of data that have now been, codified as data, have now been made computation ready, have now been translated into algorithms available for targeting and all the rest. This is simply illegitimate. So when we're talking about data protection, especially in the year 2021, when I've suggested most of the privacy that we set out to protect has already been destroyed. So we're talking about data protection. This is a downstream activity. I believe that our laws need to go upstream to primary data collection, extraction. And this illegitimate secret extraction of behavioral data from private experience will need to be outlawed. Extraction is illegitimate. In a digital century, we will need data and we will need our technologies, but we need them to operate tied to fundamental rights and tied to public use, public need, public good. That will not happen as long as private data extraction is legal. So when we make extraction illegal, we clear the competitive landscape for all kinds of companies who want to bring us all of these products and services in ways that will flourish, but also nourish our democratic principles, ideals, and form of government. That's what I'm looking for.
Pedro, I would ask you to some time to do another question from the public, okay? And then I will give you back the word back to you. We have some people talking about China here, no? So we know that by one side, China itself, the communist regime, is itself a surveillance champion, no? But at the same time, they are also facing a challenge from the big companies there, like Alibaba and so on. So I wonder if you have the question is, I wonder if you have some comments on how the China government, certainly not an example of a democratic one, is facing the threat brought by these corporations, how the government is reacting to the growing power of their own corporations like Alibaba, etc. This question is a little bit polemic, but are there any lessons Western democracies can learn from the Chinese state?
Well, I think there are, and I'm very glad that you raised this question. I said that as democracies, we face some very basic questions. How should we structure and organize and govern our information and communication infrastructures in a democratic digital century? How do we operate these spaces in a way that is both compatible with democracy, but also advances democracy? Well, we look to China, and the Chinese have answered these questions, but they've answered them for their own form of authoritarian government. So for at least the past decade, maybe more, but we know certainly for the last decade, the Chinese Communist Party has looked at digital technologies as a centerpiece of domestic and foreign policy. So they're exporting authoritarianism along with suites of surveillance technologies and the capabilities to use and impose those technologies and translate them into governance. So China understood early that that there would be no conversation about governance without a conversation about the digital, that these two domains were converging. Unfortunately, in the West, as my early remarks, referred to, we said, oh, well, the market is going to solve all of this. And as democracies, we turned the other way, and not in the least because our intelligence agencies in the US, but in many other countries, were very keen to have this human-generated data, as the answer to how we're going to combat the war on terror. We don't have to go down that road right now, but just to know this was an important feature of how we took the wrong turn. So now here we are 20 years later, and we don't have the kind of vision that the Chinese have. We haven't created a digital democratic society and made it the centerpiece of our domestic and foreign policy, despite the fact that all the world is yearning for this. People all over the world are yearning for a way to, exit the dystopian nightmare that the digital century is becoming. And they're looking to the West for this new vision and how to make it concrete of a digital democratic society and future. So we have our work cut out for us. And I think that competitive framework with China is an important one, not the way the tech companies have presented it to us. We've got to become even better than China at the surveillance game. That's how, Eric Schmidt and the tech
Boggles?
Powers. What do I want to say? Like the people who speak for the tech community, that generation now that speaks for the tech community, that's how they've portrayed it. We've got to become almost, more Chinese than the Chinese in mastering these surveillance technologies. That's not what will bring us power in the world. What will bring us power in the world is to help people in every region escape dystopia. That's what people want from us.
Now, Pedro, go on.
Thanks so much, Otávio. Professor, there are many assumptions in the question I will ask, so please question those if you don't agree with them.
Okay.
I know that early in your career, you've studied the Industrial Revolution. Well, since the late 18th century, we've been looking for the balance in a triangle. There's a system of thought and values, which is liberalism. There's a political system, which is democracy. And there's an economic system, which is capitalism. And the way I see it, liberalism is sort of a civilizing force. And by liberalism, I know that's a tricky word.
It is.
I mean the system of thought and values that were born with John Locke and
I was
were
going to say, yes,
taken forward by the
Yes.
Enlightenment philophers.
You
that's
mean
what
Locke,
I mean by
not
the word.
Hayek.
I mean Locke, not Hayek. I mean
Yeah.
Mill, not Mises.
I understand.
So, and the way I see it, liberalism has always been the civilizing force. It has civilized democracy because it tends to be majoritarian and tends to oppress minorities. But because of the liberal values, it hasn't, or it tends not to over time. And it has civilized capitalism as well. But of course, they all work in a triangle. Sometimes it takes time for this system to work. But I mean, look at the early 20th century in the United States, just to use an example you will know. During the government of Theodore Roosevelt, Standard Oil was divided. It was this enormous power, enormous capitalistic power, but it was divided by antitrust laws because it was in the interest of the people. but it's for the first time liberal democracies are fighting a global power, and liberal democracies work in a nation scale. I mean, the laws of the United States work in the United States. The laws of Brazil work in Brazil. The laws of the European Union work in the European Union. Liberal democracies do not work in a global scale, but these companies do. And they can move around. How can we fight them?
Yeah, well, you know, yes. And this is why I talk about information civilization, not only information society, as it were. And this is why I'm talking about a transnational dialogue and transnational collaboration, because like global warming, you know, you're absolutely right. These are global forces. However, let it be said that these are global forces that still operate in distinct markets. And they are, for now at least, American companies. And I do think that we have to begin somewhere. And I see every opportunity for us to begin, within the nation state context. I mean, imagine, Pedro, just for the sake of argument, we've had some, well, I'll give it to you very concretely. March 24th, congressional hearings on disinformation. Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, when it's her time to question the tech executives, she discusses a bill that she's developing, which she calls a bill to ban surveillance advertising. Now, surveillance advertising is not all of surveillance capitalism, not anymore. As I said, it's traveled far beyond those online ad markets, but those online ad markets are still an important core of surveillance capitalism. So here's a discussion and there's more has happened in Washington since then, but here's a discussion that is being stood up by, really important lawmakers in DC. And then we see a few months later in the EU Parliament, they're working on amendments to the Digital Services Act, groundbreaking new legislation for the European Union that would go a long way toward asserting democratic governance over the tech companies. And we have amendments there that are asserting a ban on surveillance advertising. Both in the EU and in the United States, we've had petitions presented in the United States to the Federal Trade Commission. In the EU, a who's who of 100 civil society, civil rights organizations presenting a petition to the European Parliament, demanding in both cases a ban on surveillance advertising, right? And most recently, a huge survey that was done in the United States, so it's US data, but agree, disagree to the following statement: 93% of Americans, the people responding to this survey, 93% agreed that personal data being collected by private companies should be illegal. So this is what I mean by the undiscussable becoming discussable. This is just one organic example of how within nation state contexts, there is a sense of a changing tide of something, something can be contested that even a couple of years ago, nobody thought was contestable. So, maybe I'm looking at this too simplistically, but I think we have a basis within our nation states. We're seeing vanguards of lawmakers in the EU, in the UK, in the US, kind of coming together with a consensus around some of these things. The tech power is one of the few issues that can actually attract some bilateral support in my country, bipartisan support in my country, which has become increasingly rare, as you know. And also around the issue of children's rights, that children's rights must apply in every realm, including the digital realm. This is another one of those arenas where there have been substantial developments within nation states on the way to cross-national collaboration. And by the way, this summer we had Alexandra Giza, a prominent member of the European Parliament, Lori Trahan, a prominent congresswoman in the US, holding a public event, joint public event on banning surveillance-based advertising. So again, we've got to build the scaffolding to that transnational work, which inevitably must occur. And the scaffolding will begin within our national communities, but of course it cannot end there.
I will bring a question from the public here. It seems to me that there is an overvaluation of AI algorithms. How can such a new technique, deep learning, still in its childhood, be able to produce such assertive impacts on users, including subjectivity? Do you have empirical research with scientific rigor that demonstrates these claims?
Well, there's so much research on this, and it's a very good question. The most recent, if you're really interested in following this up, I would urge you to look at the December 14th issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. National Academy of Science being, here in the US, one of our great institutions. The entire issue is devoted to this question. Most of the research pieces there are looking at the relationship between polarization as achieved through the online milieu, these dynamics that I've been discussing, and it's how polarization works to alter behavior in ways that weaken democracy. So that's just one recent set of publications that are very, very important. I think will stand the test of time, and very well researched materials that will probably interest you given the nature of this question. But honestly, if you look at my book, you will see, there's about, 150, 200 pages of endnotes in my book. And a good deal of that is referring to the many, 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 first-class research studies that have been done in this field. So when I make a statement that may sound very sweeping and audacious, I promise you that many, many years of, the careful collation of scholarly research has gone into my thinking, and that undergird the statements that I make.
We have a presidential election next year. For the first time in Brazilian history, there's not one single congressperson that is to the right of the president. I mean, he's actually in the extreme right. We did have our share of dictatorships, but we've never had an extremist in the presidency, like is the case of Jair Bolsonaro. You got rid of Donald Trump. Is there any lesson we should think about the American experience?
The American election, and I've written about this in some detail, but the American election was so poisoned by surveillance capitalism. I've called it the other coup, because in addition to the sort of botched or failed coup that Trump himself tried to lead, and its expression in violent expression on January 6th. In addition to that, you know, we had social media, primarily Facebook being the biggest social media footprint, and therefore the most dangerous in this regard. We had social media saturated with disinformation, with violence and hate and polarizing content. And we had Mr. Zuckerberg standing down, Mr. Zuckerberg refusing to intervene in the way that I've suggested that he can. A little bit more pressure on that key, a little bit less pressure on that key, and the whole situation changes. And this is, of course, the message that Frances Hogan has so bravely brought to us. We knew this from investigative reporters like yourself, Pedro, who've been so brave over these last years, finding the sources, finding the informants, getting the information, getting the picture. So, you know, within the specialist community, I mean, we've understood this. But what Frances did is she brought the documents. She smuggled out the documents at great personal risk. So we celebrate her. And those documents show just how much, you know, Zuckerberg and the other companies, they stood down when they should have intervened. And if they had to, just pull the darn plug. You know, Facebook shut down its pages in Australia in order to show its muscle. This is an example I use of epistemic dominance. Show its muscle to the Australian Prime Minister and the Australian Parliament, because it didn't want to come under the new parliamentary code that would force it to pay news companies for news content on Facebook pages. Content that they stole years ago and have had for free ever since. Rather than negotiate in Parliament, Facebook shut down many of its pages. Just like that, overnight, no warning. You know, if Facebook is so out of control of what's happening on its platform that it can't stop the lies that are driving the violence, then it could have just shut down. But look, Facebook is a child of Milton Friedman. Zuckerberg was taught by Milton Friedman to profit maximize in order to fulfill his social responsibility. That's what he's been doing ever since. None of us should be surprised. So that's why we need law. But the bottom line is that despite the relentless power of social media to drive disinformation and really confuse people, deter votes, all the things that we've been talking about, people in my country wanted to vote, and they wanted to vote against Trump. And people came out in droves in a pandemic. They voted early, they voted by mail, but they also came to the polling stations. And when they had to, they stood in line. They did more people voted in that presidential election, I believe, than in any other. People wanted to vote. They wanted to self-govern, and they wanted to vote to save our country from the very kind of authoritarianism and fascism that that has been Brazil's tragic destiny these last years. So that, to me, is the lesson, you know, that despite the lies and the disinformation, in my country, we still saw majorities, important majorities, that insisted on voting and that would not let those forces take control. Would those majorities have been larger without these massive campaigns of poisoning disinformation on our social media? Absolutely, they would have. I believe that unequivocally. But even despite this other coup, the democratic spirit prevailed. So, you know, as Democrats in Brazil, the democracy-loving citizens in Brazil really need to fight against the social media disinformation. And it's not easy, I understand, but that is absolutely critical. They really need to fight to get out the vote and to get it to every qualified, eligible voter who wants to vote for democracy. This is, you know, commandeering hundreds of thousands of volunteers, millions of volunteers to get out that democratic vote and to be countering in every way the lies on social media. And with those two things, I think that Brazil, which had been a beacon of a thriving, young, creative, energetic democracy for quite a few years before this tragic turn, you know, there is a great latent force there in your extraordinary country. And I hope that with the right organization and mobilization, you can turn out that force and turn the tide back.
I will bring two questions that are related, so then you can answer together. One says, since the surveillance capitalism is harmful to democracy systems, are we able to tell that the personal data protection should not be based on individuals' decisions about its data, or at least that it should have a more collective approach? If yes, may we think that laws could be enough for it, or are we facing a problem so new that we also need new solutions? And the other question is, I think maybe we could put together is, what advice would you give to users to resist and protect what is left of their privacy in the face of this oppression by the big techs, and since the law is failing?
Well, both of these do kind of come down to the same issue. So well done putting these two questions together. You know, the way I would summarize the big theme here is that privacy is not private. So we have made, you know, we think we're making a kind of personal trade-off with the tech companies. You know, I'll give Facebook or Google or Amazon or whatever this little bit of data, and in return, I get this free service and all the convenience and so on and so forth. And so as individuals, we think it's a personal trade-off. We can make a calculation and it can be okay. What we don't understand is surveillance capitalism. We don't understand that you know, when we talk about trillions of data points being computed every day, the vast majority of those data are not what we knowingly give. It's what they secretly take, as when, you know, they take the fear from my face and I never even know it. So we put our photos on Facebook, let's say. Those photos are scraped by Microsoft's facial recognition system, facial recognition in the wild. And then the next thing we know is that facial recognition system of Microsoft's is being sold to military divisions, including the military division of the Chinese army that keeps Uyghur Muslims imprisoned in open-air concentration camps, imprisoned on the strength of round-the-clock pervasive surveillance, including the facial recognition surveillance built from the Facebook photos, the photos that we sent to grandma and grandpa, you know, when the baby was born. So privacy is not private, folks. There is no personal trade-off. There is no personal calculation. Most of the data that is concentrated in these companies, in their systems, that is used to boomerang back, to target us, to shape our behavior and all the rest, That is data that is being taken from us in ways that are engineered to bypass our awareness. We don't know it, we can't see it, and therefore we can't fight it. So, so we need to get very real about this. And we need to understand now that all roads lead to politics. There is no, I mean, of course, individually, you can improve your mental health very quickly, honestly, within a matter of hours, by just withdrawing from a lot of this, you know, online visibility, transparency, communication, metrics, you know, how many people follow me, how many people like what I say, all of that stuff that has us looking in a mirror and is devolving us, you know, turning us into adolescents who can't make a move unless people like me. Well, guess what? Adulthood is a lot more fun when you're not worrying about if people like you. You want to be worrying about, what do you believe? And what's really important? And what do you need to teach your children? And what do you need to know yourself? And the rest will all follow from that integrity. A good life will follow from that integrity, not just being liked by a bunch of people that you're never even going to meet. So your mental health can be improved very quickly by withdrawing from these systems, but our politics are not necessarily going to be affected by your withdrawal as an individual. If you get 1 million other people to withdraw because you start a political campaign, then we're talking, because that's collective action. So when 1 million of us withdraw for a week from Facebook or any other one of these platforms, they will hear us. Most importantly, our lawmakers will hear us. Everything now leads toward politics. It's about collective action. If you're a student, get your fellow students. If you're a teacher, get your fellow teachers. If you live in a neighborhood, get your neighbors. If you're in an institution, get your fellow employees, your colleagues. Doesn't matter who the collective is. Get people, join arms, go and lobby your politicians, knock on their doors, camp out in their offices, let them know that you, the public, citizens, insist that these conditions be altered, insist on a democratic and digital future, that we do not sacrifice the advantages of data, learning, and technology to this unaccountable and autocratic power. So this is a time for organizing, folks. It won't be the same as the 20th century. It will be new forms. They will be purpose-built. We do have to figure them out. You know, people have now, you know, if you look into the literature, you will see there are data collectives that are community-based, data collectives that are institutionally and professionally based, all kinds of new forms that are coming on stream to allow us to take collective action in these new ways and let our lawmakers know that we insist. I hope that that goes a little way toward answering your very important questions. So thank you.
Great, Professor. Well, I would like to thank our partners in this event, Abergi and Intrínseca. I'd like to thank Professor Shoshana. I'd like to thank Pedro Doria, and also everybody who came to participate here. I'm very sorry, could not do all the questions, would need another hour for that. But we did quite some of them. So thank you for everybody who sent questions. And thank you very much, Professor. It was very, very good. Pedro, would you like to say something?
Well, it was quite insightful, Professor. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
See you soon.
Best
of luck. Best of luck, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.